The boy had been walking the streets for hours, his stomach growling and his shoes worn down at the heels. The city was full of noise, with people rushing by in their own world, hardly noticing anything outside of their path. But he carried with him a small, battered piano that seemed far too heavy for someone so small. He had found it discarded behind an old music shop a few months ago, and though it was scratched, dented, and out of tune, it had become his closest companion. He stopped for a moment in front of a cafe, the aroma of fresh bread and coffee reaching his nose. His stomach twisted with hunger, but he knew he had no money, only his music. He had learned that people might smile at him, maybe even offer him a few coins or a bit of food if he could make them stop for just a few minutes. So he set the piano down, its legs wobbling on the uneven pavement, and sat in front of it. Taking a deep breath, he called out softly, almost shyly, "I can play for a piece of food." His voice was small, almost lost among the chatter of the busy street. A few people glanced at him and laughed, thinking it was a joke. How could a thin boy with messy hair and dirty clothes possibly have anything worthwhile to offer? One woman shook her head and whispered something to her friend, both of them smirking as they walked by. But the boy did not let the laughter shake him. He had learned long ago that people often judge too quickly, and that sometimes the most unexpected things could surprise them. He pressed a key, and a note rang out, shaky at first, then stronger as his fingers moved with purpose. People passing by slowed down slightly, some turning to watch. The music had a strange quality to it. It was not perfect, but it carried feeling. It spoke of something beyond the street, beyond the noise and the rush of life, something deep that made people pause, even if just for a moment. A man sitting at a cafe table leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. He had seen street performers before, and most of them had been ordinary at best. But there was something different about this boy. The notes were simple, but they were heartfelt. They made him stop his conversation, and even the chatter of the cafe seemed to soften around the boy's music. The boy's stomach rumbled again, reminding him why he was here. But he did not stop playing. Each key he pressed carried a story, a small piece of himself that he could share without words. Slowly, more people gathered, a small crowd forming around the piano. Some were curious, some skeptical, but all were drawn in by the sound. There was a young woman with a stroller who paused, her baby staring wide-eyed at the tiny pianist. An old man leaning on a cane smiled, nodding his head in time with the music. A few coins and pieces of bread were dropped onto the piano bench. The boy smiled, not out of pride, but because for the first time that day, he felt seen. He carefully picked up a small piece of bread and took a bite, savoring it. It was not much, but it was enough to keep him going, to give him energy to continue sharing his music. People began to talk quietly among themselves. "He's really good," one woman said, shaking her head in disbelief. Another nodded. "He's just a kid, but listen to him. There's something special there." The boy didn't hear every word, but he felt the shift in the air. The laughter had faded, replaced by interest and even admiration. Hours passed, though the boy didn't notice. The street changed from morning to afternoon, the sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. He played for those who stopped, never demanding anything, only offering his music in exchange for a small act of kindness. Some people walked by without noticing him, but that did not matter. Those who did stop were enough. They were enough to remind him that his music could reach others, even when words failed. By the time the evening arrived, the boy was tired, his fingers sore, but his heart was full. The small crowd that had formed earlier had dispersed, but a few stayed, lingering near the piano, speaking quietly among themselves, smiling at the boy as he packed up his small belongings. One of them, a man with a notebook and a pen, approached him cautiously. "You have real talent," the man said. "Have you ever thought about playing somewhere more official, somewhere people can really hear you?" The boy looked at him, unsure what to say. Most adults had always brushed him off or laughed at his offers, but this man seemed different. There was no mockery in his eyes, only genuine interest. The boy shook his head slowly, unsure if he could leave the streets that had been both cruel and kind to him. But for the first time, he felt the possibility of something more. He could imagine a place where people listened, not out of pity or curiosity, but because they truly wanted to hear what he had to say through his music. As the cafe lights flickered on and the city streets grew quieter, the boy lifted the piano and began to move down the street again. He hummed softly to himself, a tune that had formed during the day's playing. It was a small song, simple and unpolished, but it carried hope. With every note, He imagined a future where people would listen, not just for a piece of food, but because his music mattered. The streets were full of shadows and the occasional passerby, but the boy did not mind. He had found a rhythm to his life, a way to survive and to express himself. Music had always been his companion, his voice when words failed. Tonight, it would guide him to wherever the next opportunity awaited. And though he did not know what tomorrow would bring, he felt a quiet certainty that his small piano, his hungry stomach, and his relentless determination were enough to face another day. For now, he walked, played, and dreamed, carrying with him the hope that one day, people would no longer laugh at the offer of music for food, but listen, truly listen, to the story he had to tell through every key, every note, and every melody he could create. The next morning, the boy woke before the sun had fully risen. The streets were quiet, except for the distant sounds of a few carts being pulled over the cobblestones, and the soft murmur of early risers. He carried his old piano once again, careful not to drop it as he made his way to a small square near the center of town. He had decided to try a new spot today, hoping for a crowd that would notice him before walking past. He set the piano down, its legs slightly wobbling on the uneven stone, and sat in front of it. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment, feeling the familiar grooves and scratches that had become almost like old friends to him. Taking a deep breath, he began to play. The first notes were soft and uncertain, like the beginning of a conversation with someone new. Then the music began to flow more confidently, each note rising and falling, carrying a story that only he knew. A few people passed by, glancing briefly at the boy before continuing on their way. A street vendor with a cart full of fruit paused for a moment, intrigued by the sound. He leaned on his counter, listening quietly, not wanting to disturb the music. The boy's fingers moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so small and so young. Each note held emotion, sadness, hope, and a touch of joy that made anyone listening feel something deep inside. Soon, a small crowd began to gather. Children stopped to watch, their eyes wide with wonder, pointing at the boy as he played. An older woman leaned on her cane, her face softening as the music washed over her. People who had been skeptical at first were now captivated. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Listen to him," one said. "He's amazing," another added quietly. A man in a suit who had been walking briskly across the square stopped, adjusting his tie. He had seen many street performers before, but something about this boy was different. The music was not just a performance. It was a message. It spoke of a life lived on the edges, of hunger and struggle, but also of resilience and hope. The man's eyes softened as he listened, and he found himself dropping a few coins into the open piano bench. The boy smiled at the small gesture, feeling warmth spread through him. He took a small piece of bread offered by a kind woman and continued to play, his energy renewed. The music flowed faster now, more intricate and bold. It was as if the piano itself was alive, responding to the boy's touch, echoing the dreams he carried in his heart. People leaned in closer, some swaying slightly to the rhythm, others closing their eyes to fully absorb the melodies. An older man, who had been sitting quietly at a nearby bench, finally spoke up. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and admiration. The boy shrugged, not wanting to speak too much. Words were never enough. His music had always been his voice, and he trusted it to tell the story better than he ever could. A young mother with a baby in her arms approached slowly. She had been watching from a distance, unsure whether to stop. When the music reached a gentle, flowing section, she let her baby rest his head against her chest, letting the soft notes calm him. The boy noticed and played even more tenderly, careful not to overwhelm the small child with harsh sounds. Music had this power, he realized, to touch people in ways words never could. Hours passed quickly. The boy played with a mixture of intensity and delicacy, switching between lively, upbeat pieces and soft, emotional tunes. The crowd grew larger, people coming from nearby streets to see the young prodigy who had been offering his music in exchange for food. Some were curious, some doubtful, but all left feeling something they could not quite describe. A man with a notebook approached once more. He had seen the boy yesterday as well and had spent the night thinking about him. Now, seeing the crowd and witnessing the boy's talent firsthand, he felt certain that this child had something extraordinary. He knelt beside the piano and whispered quietly, so only the boy could hear, "You have a gift that could reach far beyond this street. Have you ever thought about sharing it with the world?" The boy paused, his hands hovering above the keys. He had thought about it in fleeting moments, but fear and uncertainty always held him back. Leaving the streets meant leaving the familiar, even if it was harsh. But the man's words planted a seed of possibility. The sun climbed higher, and the city grew busier. Yet, the boy remained focused, lost in the music, feeling each note resonate through him and out into the world. A few local musicians who had been passing by stopped to listen. One of them, an older woman with a violin, nodded approvingly, recognizing the skill and emotion in his playing. She whispered to a friend, "This boy could be a star if someone guided him properly." The boy's stomach rumbled again, a reminder of his needs, but he ignored it, determined to give his all. Every coin, every piece of bread, and every smile from the crowd fueled him. The music became more intricate, faster, and more expressive. People began clapping along, encouraged by the rhythm and energy. The atmosphere transformed, from curiosity to admiration to celebration. As evening approached, the boy finally paused, letting the last notes linger in the air. The crowd erupted into soft applause, some still whispering their amazement. The boy packed up his piano, tired but exhilarated. The streets had been kind today, offering him more than just food. They had given him recognition, a small taste of respect and admiration that he had rarely experienced. The man with the notebook approached again. "I want to help you," he said simply. "There are people who would listen to you, who would support you, if you let them." The boy looked at him carefully. Trust was not something he gave easily, but there was sincerity in the man's eyes. For the first time, he considered the idea that he could belong somewhere other than the streets, that his music could reach more people than just those who passed him by. That night, as the boy lay down in a small corner of a friendly inn that allowed him to sleep in exchange for helping with chores, he thought about the day. The faces of the people who had stopped to listen flashed through his mind, the sound of their whispers, their smiles, their appreciation. And then he thought about the possibilities the man had mentioned. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him where people would listen, where his music could matter, and where he could be more than a boy playing for a piece of food. Sleep finally took him, but dreams filled with music and hope swirled in his mind. He imagined a stage, bright lights, an audience listening intently, and the sound of his piano filling the room with melodies that touched hearts. For the first time, he did not dream about surviving the streets or finding his next meal. He dreamed about being heard, truly heard, and the thought made his heart race with excitement and a little fear. Tomorrow, he decided silently, he would play again, and maybe, just maybe, take another step toward the life he had begun to imagine. For now, he slept, letting the quiet hum of the city and the distant clatter of carts lull him into a peaceful rest, carrying the promise of a day filled with music, discovery, and the first glimpses of a future that felt more real than anything he had dared to hope for before. The boy woke up to the soft glow of morning light spilling through the small window of the inn. He could hear the distant clatter of carts on the cobblestone streets and the murmur of early risers, preparing for the day. Even though he had slept on a thin mattress, he felt more rested than he had in weeks. The promise of the day ahead filled him with a quiet excitement. He gathered his few belongings and lifted the piano once again, feeling its familiar weight against his small frame. Today, he decided to return to the square where he had drawn the largest crowd the previous day. Something inside him told him that the people there would listen more closely, that his music could reach even further than before. He moved carefully, navigating the busy streets, carrying his piano like a companion who had shared every hardship and every moment of hope with him. As he arrived at the square, he noticed a few early pedestrians, but not many. The air was still crisp, and the light was soft, filtering through the buildings and casting long shadows across the stone ground. He set the piano down, its legs wobbling slightly, and ran his fingers across the keys, making sure they were still in working order. Each key had its own story, and the boy knew them all by touch. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft and hesitant, almost as if the piano itself was waking up from a long sleep. Then the music grew stronger, more confident, carrying a mixture of emotions that he had felt deep within him, but had never been able to express with words. Each chord, each melody, seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those who happened to pass by. It was a language that everyone understood, no matter their age or background. A few people stopped to listen immediately. An older man with a cane leaned against a lamppost, nodding his head slowly as if counting the rhythm. A young woman carrying a basket of bread paused, her expression softening as the music filled her ears. Even a few children who had been running nearby slowed down, curious about the strange, beautiful sound coming from the small piano in the square. Word spread quickly. A few merchants from nearby stalls came out to listen, whispering to one another in disbelief. The boy's fingers moved rapidly over the keys, sometimes gentle, sometimes forceful, always conveying emotion. People who had been skeptical before were now captivated. There was something in the way he played that made them feel the story behind every note. They could see the hunger, the struggle, the hope, and the joy in each chord. It was not just music. It was a window into a life that most of them had never truly understood. As the boy continued to play, the crowd grew. People who had been walking down other streets turned back, drawn by the sound. Some brought friends, eager to share the discovery of this remarkable child who played not for fame or money, but for the sheer love of music and survival. Coins and small pieces of bread began to accumulate on the piano bench, and the boy smiled quietly, grateful for the small gestures of kindness. Among the crowd was the man with the notebook, who had followed the boy again. He watched intently, jotting down notes about the boy's technique, the emotion in his performance, and the reactions of the people around him. He could see that the boy had the potential to reach far beyond the streets, that his talent was not something to be hidden or used only for survival. It was extraordinary, and it deserved to be nurtured. The boy's music shifted, moving from soft, melancholy pieces to lively, joyful tunes that made people clap along and tap their feet. Even the children who had been shyly observing began to move with the rhythm, their eyes shining with excitement. Some of the older listeners smiled, laughing quietly at the infectious energy of the music. The boy's small hands flew over the keys, almost dancing with them, and the piano sang under his touch. Even though it was old and out of tune in some places, the local musician, carrying a violin case, stopped to watch. She had been passing by, skeptical at first, but now she stood still, listening in awe. There was something raw and honest in the boy's performance, a truth that she recognized instantly. She whispered to a friend, "This child has a gift that cannot be taught. It is in him naturally. He could play anywhere and touch hearts anywhere." Time passed unnoticed. The morning faded into afternoon, the sunlight brightening and then softening as it moved across the square. The boy played tirelessly, taking only a few moments to eat the bread he had been given, sustaining himself so he could continue. He was unaware of how many people had gathered, how many had stopped to listen, or how many were whispering among themselves about the extraordinary talent before them. All he knew was the music, the keys, and the connection he felt with every person who paused to hear him. Eventually, the boy noticed that some people were taking out their phones, recording snippets of his performance. Some were taking photos, their faces lit with amazement. He felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, shyness, and a hint of fear. This was new to him. He had always played for whoever happened to pass, not imagining that people would want to capture the moment or share it with others. But he continued to play, letting the music speak louder than any words could. The man with the notebook approached once more as the crowd began to thin. He knelt beside the piano and whispered, "You are incredible. I want to help you share this gift with more people. There are teachers, patrons, and musicians who would support you if you allowed it. You could perform on real stages, be heard by many more than just those who pass through this square." The boy looked at him, his eyes wide, unsure whether to believe such words. He had spent so long surviving, so long being unnoticed, that the idea of a larger world noticing him seemed almost impossible. But the seed of possibility had been planted. He began to imagine a life beyond the streets, where he could play without worrying about hunger or where he would sleep. He thought of a stage, an audience, and a place where music was not just survival, but celebration. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel hope. As evening approached, the boy packed up his piano, careful not to damage it. He thanked the few remaining listeners, their smiles and kind words leaving a warm glow in his chest. He lifted the piano once more, feeling its weight as both a burden and a comfort. The streets were quiet now, but his mind was alive with possibilities. Tomorrow, he decided, he would play again, and perhaps take another step toward the world that had begun to open its doors to him. That night, as he rested in the small inn, he thought about the faces he had seen, the expressions of awe, curiosity, and admiration. He thought about the man with the notebook and the violinist, about the children who had danced to his music, and the adults who had paused to listen. All of them had seen him, really seen him, for the first time, and that recognition, however small, filled him with a sense of belonging he had never known. He lay down on the thin mattress, closing his eyes, and let the sounds of the city drift into his dreams. In his mind, the piano was no longer confined to the square or the streets. It was on grand stages, in halls filled with people who listened intently. He saw himself playing with other musicians, performing pieces he had only ever imagined, feeling the music resonate with a larger audience. It was a dream that felt both thrilling and terrifying, but he embraced it with a cautious excitement. Before sleep overtook him, he made a promise to himself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would continue to play, continue to share his music, and continue to reach for the life that had begun to take shape in his mind. The streets had given him survival and resilience, but now they had also given him hope, and that hope, more than anything, would guide him forward, note by note, day by day, toward a future where his music could touch countless hearts. The morning light spilled across the streets as the boy carried his piano toward the square. Once more, today felt different. The city was alive with a buzz that seemed to follow him, as if everyone knew something had changed. Perhaps it was the growing curiosity about the boy who played so beautifully, or perhaps it was the quiet hope he carried in his heart. Whatever it was, he felt it in the way the air seemed lighter, the way people glanced at him with interest instead of dismissive glances. He set the piano down carefully, adjusting its legs on the uneven stones. As always, he ran his fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar grooves and scratches that had become part of him. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the music flow naturally. The first notes were soft, inviting people to pause, to listen, to step out of their hurried lives for just a few moments. Slowly, the notes grew louder, bolder, carrying emotion that seemed far older than the boy himself. A crowd began to gather more quickly than usual. Passers-by who had heard whispers from the streets about the boy came to see for themselves. Some brought friends, eager to witness the talent that had stirred so much talk. Children watched wide-eyed, their fingers tapping the stone in rhythm with the melody. Adults listened quietly, their expressions softening as they were drawn into the music. Even the merchants from nearby stalls paused, leaning against their counters, mesmerized. Among the crowd was the violinist who had watched the boy before. She had returned to see how he had progressed, and her eyes glimmered with admiration. Beside her was the man with the notebook, now carrying additional papers and notes, a faint smile on his face. He had been thinking of ways to introduce the boy to a larger audience, to help him move beyond the streets. Today, he intended to act. The boy's hands moved deftly across the keys, producing melodies that were both delicate and powerful. There was a story in every note, a narrative of struggle, resilience, and hope that everyone around him could feel. The crowd seemed suspended in time, listening to a story told without words, only through the boy's music. Coins and small notes began to appear on the piano bench, gifts from those who had been touched by the music. But beyond the gestures, it was the silent acknowledgement, the attention, the respect that mattered most to him. As the afternoon sun climbed, a car slowly pulled up near the square. A tall figure stepped out, dressed neatly, carrying a folder. He moved toward the boy and the crowd, and whispers spread among the listeners. He was a music teacher from the city's conservatory, known for spotting talent in unexpected places. He had come to see if the rumors about the street pianist were true. The boy did not notice him at first. He was fully immersed in the music, his small fingers flying over the keys, producing melodies that seemed impossible for someone his age. The teacher watched quietly, his eyes scanning every motion, every note. He was impressed not only by the technical skill, but by the emotion that radiated from the boy. There was a depth to his playing that could not be taught, a raw talent that demanded attention. When the boy finished a particularly complex piece, the crowd erupted into applause. The teacher stepped forward, careful not to startle the child, and spoke in a calm, encouraging voice. "You have an incredible gift. I have been listening, and I believe your talent should be shared on a larger stage. Would you consider performing in a concert? We can offer guidance, training, and an opportunity to be heard by many people who will truly appreciate your music." The boy paused, unsure what to say. Leaving the streets meant leaving the life he knew, the routines that had kept him alive. But something in the teacher's eyes, the sincerity, the excitement, stirred something inside him. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where his music could reach far beyond the square, where people would listen not out of curiosity or pity, but because they genuinely wanted to hear him play. The violinist nodded encouragingly, whispering, "You can do it. Your music deserves to be heard. This could be the beginning of something amazing." The man with the notebook added, "We'll be with you every step of the way." "You won't have to face it alone." The boy looked at them, absorbing their words, feeling a strange mix of excitement and fear. The streets had been harsh, but they had also shaped him. Could he step into a world so different, one that promised opportunity and recognition? The crowd remained, sensing the importance of the moment. There was a quiet stillness, a collective holding of breath. They had watched the boy grow, listened to his music, and now they were witnessing a turning point. He had survived the streets, charmed the square with his melodies, and now, for the first time, he was being offered a choice that could change his life entirely. After a long pause, the boy nodded slowly, a small smile spreading across his face. It was a tentative step, but it was enough. He would take the chance. The teacher's eyes lit up, and he offered his hand, not to pull the boy forward forcefully, but to guide him gently. The boy took it, feeling a rush of both fear and excitement. It was unfamiliar, stepping into the unknown, but it was also thrilling. Plans began immediately. The teacher spoke quietly, outlining how they could arrange lessons, how they would prepare him for a small concert that would allow others to hear his extraordinary talent. The violinist offered to help, promising to guide him through the nuances of performing alongside other musicians. The man with the notebook recorded everything, ensuring that every opportunity and detail was captured. The boy listened carefully, taking in the possibilities with a mix of awe and disbelief. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, the boy packed up his piano for the last time in that spot. The crowd had dwindled, but a few lingered, waving and smiling at him. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the journey they had witnessed. Others offered small gifts of encouragement, knowing that this boy had something special that would soon be shared far beyond their city. The boy walked with the teacher and his two new friends through the quiet streets, carrying the piano with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The evening air was cool, filled with the smells of baked bread and evening meals. For the first time, he felt a sense of possibility, a glimpse of a world where he could be recognized not for surviving, but for thriving. That night, in a small room arranged by the teacher, the boy sat at a proper piano, polished and tuned, feeling its weight differently from the old one he had carried through the streets. He pressed the keys, and the notes rang out clear and strong, each one resonating with a new sense of promise. He realized that this was more than just music. It was a doorway, a path to something larger, something beautiful. The streets had given him survival, courage, and resilience, but now the music itself was becoming a bridge to a life he had only dared to dream of. As he lay down to sleep that night, the boy thought about the day, the crowd, the teacher, the violinist, and the strange, exhilarating feeling of hope. He understood that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, new rules, and expectations. But for the first time, he also felt a sense of belonging, a knowledge that his music was valuable, and that people wanted to hear it for what it was, a story, a voice, a gift that came from deep within him. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet hum of the city lull him to sleep, imagining the stage, the lights, and the audience that would soon hear his music. He knew the journey was just beginning, but it was a journey he was ready to take. The piano, his constant companion, sat beside him, ready to tell the story of a boy who had once played for a piece of food, and who was now stepping into a world that had finally begun to listen. The boy awoke early in a small, sunlit room arranged by the teacher. The piano in front of him was polished and full of life, unlike the one he had carried through streets and alleys for so long. Its keys gleamed, inviting him to play, and for a moment, he simply sat and ran his fingers over them. The sound was clear, pure, and it reminded him of how far he had come. From playing for scraps of food in a busy square to being offered guidance by experienced musicians, his life had shifted in ways he had never imagined. Today was important. The teacher had arranged a small concert in a nearby hall for a few local patrons, musicians, and people who had taken notice of his talent. It was his first chance to perform for more than the random passersby of the streets. The boy felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had never performed in a place like this before. The streets had been forgiving, the piano his old companion, and the audience forgiving. Here, expectations would be higher, and the stakes felt much larger. He practiced one last time, moving through a sequence of melodies he had composed himself, interweaving them with pieces the teacher had suggested to improve his technique. Each note felt different on the proper piano, and he could feel the resonance in the floor and walls. The room seemed to vibrate with possibility, as if the piano itself was alive and encouraging him. By mid-morning, the hall was filling with people, musicians, Patrons, and even some townsfolk who had followed his story arrived, curious to hear the boy who had played for food. The air was thick with anticipation. He could hear whispers of admiration, people remarking on how far he had come and how special his talent was. He felt both nervous and exhilarated. When it was his turn to perform, the boy walked to the piano, carrying the weight of expectation, but also the confidence he had built over months of playing on the streets. He sat down, took a deep breath, and let his fingers hover above the keys. The first note rang out, clear and confident. It startled him slightly, reminding him how different this piano was from his old companion. But as he continued, his fingers found their rhythm, and the music began to flow as naturally as it had in the square. He played pieces full of emotion, alternating between soft, tender melodies and more energetic, uplifting tunes. Each note carried a piece of his life, the struggles, the hunger, the small victories, and the hope that had grown within him. The audience listened intently, some closing their eyes to immerse themselves in the music, others leaning forward, hanging on to every sound. For the first time, he felt that his music was being appreciated not out of pity or curiosity, but because it truly mattered to people. A few moments into his performance, he noticed the violinist from the square sitting nearby, her eyes shining with pride. The man with the notebook was also there, capturing the moment, his pen moving quickly as he recorded the reactions of the audience. Their presence gave him courage. He felt a surge of energy, letting the music carry him, letting it speak louder than any fear or doubt he had. The hall was silent except for the sound of the piano. Each note seemed to echo, filling every corner with emotion. When he transitioned into a particularly difficult sequence, he felt the music pulse through his body, guiding his hands and telling a story that words could never fully express. The audience was captivated, leaning in as if the notes themselves held secrets they were discovering for the first time. By the end of the performance, the boy's hands were tired but steady. The last note lingered in the hall, leaving a hushed reverence in its wake. Then, slowly, applause began. At first, it was quiet, tentative, as people processed what they had just heard. Then it grew louder, warmer, filling the room with admiration and awe. The boy looked up, surprised by the intensity of their appreciation. He had never experienced anything like this. The streets had given him an audience that paused for a moment. But this was recognition, acknowledgement of his skill, and validation of the journey he had taken. The teacher stepped forward, smiling broadly, and whispered, "You did wonderfully. This is only the beginning." The violinist nodded, her eyes glistening, adding, "You have touched them. Your music will reach far beyond these walls now." The boy felt a strange mix of pride and humility. He had achieved something that had once seemed impossible, yet he knew this was just the start of a new chapter. Over the next few weeks, opportunities began to multiply. The teacher introduced him to other musicians, helped him improve his technique, and guided him in composing new pieces. Patrons who had heard him perform offered support, ensuring he had proper lessons, instruments, and places to play. Each day brought new challenges and new learning, but the boy approached them with the same determination he had used to survive the streets. Music had been his survival, and now it was becoming his life. He never forgot the streets or the people who had once laughed at his offer to play for food. They had shaped him, taught him resilience, humility, and the power of persistence. Whenever he performed, he carried their lessons with him, infusing his music with the raw, honest emotion of his experiences. It was this authenticity that drew people to him, that made his performances unforgettable, and that turned simple melodies into stories that touched hearts. Months passed, and the boy's reputation grew. He played in larger halls, collaborated with other musicians, and even began teaching younger students who showed promise. But he remained grounded, never forgetting where he had come from or the struggles that had made him who he was. Every note he played carried gratitude for the life he had been given, for the teachers and friends who had guided him, and for the moments of beauty and challenge that had defined his journey. Evenings were often quiet, when he sat alone at the piano, composing pieces that reflected his experiences. He thought about the laughter in the square, the coins and bread he had earned, the people who had stopped to listen, and the friends who had helped him step into the world. Music had transformed his life, but it had also preserved the memory of where he had begun. He understood that his journey was not only about recognition or applause, but about sharing something deep and human, something that could connect people across different walks of life. One afternoon, as he played in a small concert for a local community, he noticed a familiar face in the audience, a woman who had once given him a piece of bread in the square. She smiled and nodded, and he felt a warmth spread through him. It was a reminder that his music was still tied to the streets, to the people who had supported him when he had nothing to offer but his talent. He played with even more emotion, honoring those who had believed in him when no one else would. Years went by, and the boy, now a young man, became a celebrated pianist. His story spread far beyond the city, inspiring others who had faced hardships or been overlooked. He remained humble, understanding that talent alone was not enough. It was perseverance, courage, and the willingness to share oneself that made the difference. People who had once laughed at his offer to play for food now marveled at the journey he had taken, seeing proof that true talent could emerge from the most unlikely places. Even as fame and recognition grew, he always remembered the lessons of the streets: to stay grounded, to play from the heart, and to never lose sight of the people who had helped him reach this point. His music continued to tell stories, not only of skill and mastery, but of humanity, resilience, and hope. Every performance was a testament to the journey he had undertaken, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the humblest beginnings. At the end of the day, when the audience had left and the hall was quiet, he sat alone at the piano, fingers brushing the keys gently. He reflected on the boy he had once been, wandering the streets, hungry, and carrying a battered piano. The journey had been long, challenging, and full of uncertainty, but it had led him to a life where his music mattered, where it touched hearts, and where he could finally be heard. He played one final melody for the day, a piece that carried every note of his past, every struggle, every kindness, and every moment of hope. It was a song for the streets, for the people who had stopped to listen, for the friends and mentors who had guided him, and for the boy who had dared to dream. As the last note faded into silence, he smiled, knowing that his journey was far from over, but that he had arrived at a place where music, hope, and human connection would continue to guide him through every step of life.